The last image I want you to hold is a woman standing at the back of a church, very still, while the man who buried her announced his engagement to someone else. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She waited the way you wait for a sentence to end before you correct it. Take that image and let me bring you back to where it started. The church smelled like candle wax and wet wool. That was the first thing I registered when I pushed open the heavy oak door at the back of St. Aldrich's, a smell I'd grown up with from every baptism and Christmas service my family had dragged me to. Wax and wool, and the faint chemical undertone of someone's hairspray. I stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds before I let the door close behind me. The congregation was packed. I counted roughly 200 people filling the pews of a church that seated 160, which meant some of them were standing along the side walls. Black coats, pale faces, the occasional white handkerchief pressed to a cheek. At the front, an enormous framed photograph of me sat propped on an easel. The me in the photograph was wearing a cream silk blouse and pearl earrings. I was smiling at the camera with my chin slightly lifted. Someone had chosen it carefully. I could see that. It was a photograph from the Thornfield Holdings annual gala 18 months ago. Dorian had taken it himself, standing in front of me with his phone raised, telling me to hold still. He'd told me I looked beautiful. He'd sent it to Isolde that same night, captioned, "Done by spring." I know, because I'd read it. I'd been reading things I wasn't supposed to read for the better part of 8 months before the accident. I pulled the black veil lower over my face and found a spot against the back wall. Nobody looked at me. People at funerals rarely look at strangers near the door. They assume you're late. They assume you're grieving privately. They give you the courtesy of not making eye contact, which is one of the few social contracts I've always appreciated. The priest was speaking, something about radiant light and a life cut short and the mysterious ways of providence. I let the words wash past me without snagging on any of them. I was watching Dorian. He was seated in the front left pew, in the position reserved for immediate family, which was a small piece of audacity I'd had weeks to appreciate. He was wearing a charcoal suit that I'd watched him buy at Aldercroft & Sons on the High Street the previous October. He'd asked me if the lapels were too narrow. I'd said they were fine. He was sitting with his hand resting on the pew beside him, and Isolde was sitting close enough that their arms touched. My sister was wearing a navy dress with a covered neckline, which was appropriate, and a thin gold bracelet at her left wrist, which was new. I didn't recognize it. She'd had it on for less than 3 months, I estimated, based on the slight tan line still visible on the adjacent skin where she'd previously worn her everyday watch. Small details. They had always been my domain, long before I understood that my survival might depend on them. The priest brought his remarks to a close. There was a neat collective sound from the congregation. An exhale. A shift of weight. A woman in the middle pews pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. I recognized her. Eleanor Fitch, who had been my mother's bridge partner and who had never once spoken to me with particular warmth when I was alive. She was crying with genuine feeling, which told me more about how humans work than about Eleanor Fitch specifically. Then Dorian stood up. He moved to the podium with the measured step of a man who had practiced his grief. Not overdone, not theatrical, quiet and controlled, with just enough pause before he began to speak to let the room settle into his rhythm. I had watched Dorian Calloway perform sincerity for 5 years. I knew every signal. The slight downward press of his lips before an emotional admission, the way he touched his collar before speaking in public, the 2-second pause he gave himself to appear to be searching for words he'd already chosen. "Celeste," he said, and the name came out low and weighted, and half the room inhaled. I kept my eyes on his hands. She was the kind of woman who made you feel like the room was better organized when she was in it. Like things would get sorted. Like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever problem had just presented itself. A pause. She was right. Usually. She was almost always right. There was a soft sound of agreement from somewhere in the middle pews. Someone's shoulders shook. I pressed my back against the stone wall and waited. He spoke for another 4 minutes. I timed it. The remarks were well constructed. Personal enough to feel genuine, broad enough to land for an audience who hadn't known me well. He mentioned my work at Thornfield Holdings, my habit of staying late, my ability to read a room. He did not mention my family in any specific way, which was careful, because mentioning my family too specifically would have required him to also mention Isolde, and the timing on that needed to be managed. He was going to manage it now. Well, so I saw it coming 8 seconds before it happened, because his hand went to his collar. "Before we close," Dorian said, "I want to say something that Celeste herself would have wanted acknowledged. Because she believed in honesty, she believed that the people we love deserve to be spoken of clearly." He looked out at the congregation. Then, slowly and deliberately, he looked at Isolde. In the weeks since her passing, in the grief of losing her, I found myself leaning on the person she loved most in the world, her sister. And I think Celeste, if she could speak to us now, would want us to know that love doesn't end. It continues. It finds a form. The room went very still. "Isolde and I are engaged." The silence lasted for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to be significant, short enough to prevent panic. Then the murmur began. I counted the heads that turned toward Isolde. I counted the ones that stayed facing forward, uncertain what expression to arrange. I watched a woman 2 rows from the back press her lips together so tightly they went white, which told me she was furious but not surprised. I watched Isolde lift her chin and let the room look at her. She was doing what she had always done, which was performing the thing she felt entitled to. The gold bracelet caught the candlelight. She touched it once, briefly, with her opposite hand, a self-conscious gesture she'd had since childhood, the equivalent of checking that a thing was still there. Dorian had given her that bracelet. I knew because I had the receipt. I had the receipt, the jeweler's photograph, the bank transfer, and the text message he'd sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday 3 months ago. "She'll love it. Put it on her wrist yourself." He had sent that text to Isolde. She had forwarded it to herself from a second number, a pattern I'd traced 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. I had all of it. Every piece of it was currently sitting in a file on a secure server that I had set up under a name that was not mine, with a timed send scheduled for 6 p.m. today. Every journalist on that distribution list was going to receive a comprehensive package before dinner, unless I canceled the send. I was not going to cancel the send, but first, I had someone to give something to. I reached into the pocket of my coat and closed my hand around the USB drive. It was small, compact, almost the kind of thing you could close your fist around and feel nothing from the outside. I let the murmur in the room continue. I let Dorian step down from the podium with the composed expression of a man who had just done something he considered necessary. I let Isolde receive the sympathetic and confused and quietly appalled looks of 200 people who were not yet sure what they were witnessing. And then I moved along the back wall toward the man standing near the side door. He had come in 12 minutes after I had. He was wearing a dark coat and holding a program from the service that he hadn't opened. He looked like a funeral attendee, except that funeral attendees generally look at the front of the church rather than scanning the room in slow, practiced sweeps. His name was Marcus Vane. He was a detective with the Financial Crimes Unit who had been investigating Thornfield Holdings for 14 months, mostly in the dark because he'd had leads but not documentation. I'd reached out to him 6 weeks ago through a lawyer named Josephine Aldermore, who had found me half-conscious on the riverbank 3 miles downstream from the Caldwell Bridge, and had, for reasons I still haven't fully unpacked, decided to drive me to her cottage and call no one. I pressed the USB drive into Marcus's hand without stopping. He didn't look at me. He closed his fingers around it. I kept walking. The door at the side of the church was heavy and old and made a sound when it opened, but by then, the murmur in the room had grown loud enough to cover it. The air outside was cold and bright. October in Thornfield always felt like the sky had been cleaned overnight, everything high and clear and merciless. I stood on the path for a moment and breathed it in. Then I walked to the car that Josephine had left running at the corner, got in, and didn't look back. 8 months earlier, I had been a woman who believed she understood her own life. That's the part that still catches in my chest if I let it. Not the betrayal itself, but the confidence I had that preceded it. The way I'd moved through my days, certain that I was paying attention. That I was, as Dorian would later say, at a podium in front of 200 people, 3 steps ahead. I was not 3 steps ahead. I was exactly 1 step behind in a race I didn't know I was running. The morning of the accident, the kitchen smelled like coffee and burnt toast. Well, I'd overslept by 20 minutes, something I almost never did, and I'd come downstairs to find Dorian already dressed and standing at the counter scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I came in. He smiled. That smile. I had cataloged it at some point in the past year without fully realizing I was doing it, the way it never quite reached the upper third of his face, the way it appeared in response to my entering a room before he'd had time to compose something more specific. It was the smile of a man performing a role he'd grown tired of. "You're running late," he said. "I know." I poured coffee without looking at him. "I'll take the bridge road. It's faster." He said nothing. I assumed that was agreement. I drank my coffee standing at the counter, ate half a piece of toast, outgathered my bag and my keys, and kissed him on the cheek. A gesture so automatic by then that I could not have told you whether I'd done it with my left hand or my right. I drove the Caldwell Bridge Road because it cut 11 minutes off my commute when traffic was bad, and traffic was always bad on that stretch of the town road after 7:30. I was 3 minutes from the bridge when my phone rang through the car speakers. I answered it without checking the screen. "Yes." "Pull over," said a voice I didn't recognize. I didn't pull over. I said, "Who is this?" There was a pause, and then, "Someone who read the same documents you read. Pull over before the bridge." But I didn't pull over, because the call was strange, and my instinct was to keep moving, and the bridge was already visible through the morning fog. Oh, and by the time I understood that the car behind me was not simply following the same route, it was already close enough that when it hit me from the left rear quarter panel, the impact sent my car into the low stone barrier at an angle that I had no time to correct. The Caldwell River was 31 feet below the bridge. The car hit the water roof first. I don't remember the impact with the water. I remember cold. A cold so absolute that it worked on me the way a hard restart works on a computer, clearing everything else. I remember the car filling. I remember that the driver's window had shattered in the fall, and that my seatbelt would not release on the first or second attempt, and that I had, without deciding to, shifted into the deliberate, focused state that comes when your mind has assessed that panic is not a useful tool. Also, I got the seatbelt on the third attempt. I pulled myself through the window. The current carried me. I don't know how far I went before I found something to hold. A section of fallen branch wedged against a rock cluster, the kind of debris that accumulates after autumn rains. I held it. I let it hold me. I couldn't feel my hands by then, but I could see the bank. I made the bank. I lay there on the mud and rock for an unknown amount of time, which I later calculated from the angle of the light when Josephine Aldermore found me to have been approximately 45 minutes. She was walking the river path with her dog, a large greyhound who reached me first and stood over me, blocking what wind there was, while Josephine came at a pace that was quick for a woman of her age. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She looked at me for a long moment with sharp, pale eyes, and then she said, "Can you walk?" I said I thought so. "My car is at the top of the embankment. I need you to walk to it." I walked to it. She drove. She did not call an ambulance. She took me to a white-walled cottage on the far side of Thornfield's southern boundary, some 12 miles from where she'd found me. She put me in a hot bath and brought me tea and didn't ask my name until the following morning. When she asked, I told her. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands around her own mug and said, "Celeste Calloway, your funeral is in 3 weeks." I said, "I know." She looked at me for a long moment. "Are you going to attend it?" "Eventually," I said. I need to explain Josephine Aldermore before I explain anything else about what came next. She knows because she was not a person I could have invented, and the form she took in those early weeks was something I still haven't found a clean way to account for. She was 72. She was a former barrister who had practiced commercial law for 34 years before retiring to the cottage, which had been in her family since her mother's time. She had never married. She had a dog named Cabot, who had the instincts of a therapy animal and the appetite of a small horse. She did not ask me what had happened. She asked me what I needed. The answer I gave her, 3 days after she pulled me from the riverbank, was the answer I'd been working toward since long before I knew I'd need to survive anything. I need to access a server I set up under a different name, and I need to know that my situation is documented. What kind of documentation?" Josephine asked. "Financial, criminal, the kind that makes it expensive to pretend someone doesn't exist." She set down her mug. She looked at me with the particular attention of someone who has spent decades assessing the reliability of other people's statements under pressure. "I can help with some of that," she said. "Here is what I had understood about my marriage in the 12 months before my car went off the Caldwell Bridge. I had understood it the way you understand something you've known obliquely for years, and finally looked at directly. The way you understand a habit you've been excusing has become a problem. Slowly then, with the clarity of something that cannot be unseen, Dorian Calloway was the CFO of Thornfield Holdings. And I had worked alongside him at the company for 3 years before we married. During that time, I had handled a significant portion of the regulatory compliance work, a role that was unglamorous, but that gave me access to a broad view of the company's financial architecture. I was good at it. I was particularly good at noticing anomalies in documentation patterns, which is less a skill than a disposition, the kind of thing that happens when you've spent long enough looking at financial records that you know what clean ones feel like. In the 18th month of our marriage, I noticed that a subsidiary account linked to Thornfield's Southern Holdings had begun making quarterly transfers to a private vehicle that I didn't recognize. This was not, by itself, alarming. Subsidiaries make transfers. Private vehicles receive them. As the machinery of corporate finance has 1,000 moving parts, and only some of them require explanation. What made this particular one worth noting was the structure of the transfers. They were sized at just below the threshold that would trigger automatic regulatory flagging. They were timed at irregular intervals within a consistent quarterly pattern. And the receiving account's name, Sablecroft Consulting, appeared nowhere in the current list of approved vendors. I noted it. I set a reminder. I pulled the original vendor approval documents for the past 3 years. Sablecroft Consulting appeared nowhere. I cross-referenced the authorization signatures on the transfer approvals. Dorian's signature appeared on all of them. I closed the file. I sat with that information for 11 days before I allowed myself to accept what it meant. Not because I was in denial. I had never been the kind of person who chose a comfortable interpretation of evidence over an accurate one, but because accepting it required me to also accept that the rest of my life would need to be reconfigured around this fact. And that reconfiguration took planning. I began documenting. I worked in the compliance system, which meant I had legitimate access to the files I needed to pull. I pulled them carefully and consistently. I saved copies to an external drive that I kept at the office in a document storage box labeled with a project code that corresponded to a closed file from 2019. I backed those copies to a cloud server I'd set up the previous year for a personal project under the name of a corporate entity I'd registered privately, a shell company called Vellum Consulting Limited, which existed on paper and nowhere else. Dorian did not know about Vellum. Nobody at Thornfield knew about Vellum. I had set it up 18 months before I found the first transfer anomaly as a vehicle for a real estate option I'd been considering, and then I hadn't needed it for that, and then I had needed it for something else. Over the following 6 months, I built a file. It documented the Sablecroft transfers, the authorization trail, and the pattern of regulatory timing. But as I built it, the file grew in directions I hadn't anticipated. The Sablecroft account was one mechanism. There were others. There was an inflated contract with a construction firm called Redvale Partners that had billed Thornfield for $300,000 in consulting work on a project that had never been formally approved. That there was a governance record showing that Dorian had signed off on his own compensation adjustment in a quarter where the board had been quorate by only one member, a member who had since resigned and relocated abroad. There was the small matter of a property transfer, the Thornfield estate house, the family property that Dorian's father had placed in a joint trust when we married, and which I had assumed was jointly held, had been quietly restructured through a series of legal amendments that I found when I requested the trust documents for an unrelated reason. The restructuring had removed me as a beneficial owner. It had been executed 14 months into our marriage. I sat with that one for longer, not because I cared about the property in the way that meant wanting it. I had never been particularly attached to the estate house, yes, which was cold in winter and echoed in summer, and smelled of a previous generation's choices in soft furnishings. I cared about it because of what it told me. You don't remove someone as a beneficial owner of a shared property without a plan for what comes next. You do it when you're building toward a clean separation. You do it when you've looked ahead at the legal architecture of a situation and decided to begin construction. He'd started planning while we were still, to all appearances, happy. That was the part that settled into my chest like a stone and stayed there. Not the betrayal itself. The timeline. I ran the dates. The property restructuring had occurred 14 months into our marriage. Isolde had come to stay with us for a long weekend approximately 16 months into our marriage. A visit that, at the time, and I had taken at face value, my younger sister between apartments, needing a base for a few weeks while she sorted out a rental situation. She'd stayed for 6 weeks. When she left, she and Dorian had fallen into a pattern of communication that I had originally read as the easy friendliness of two people who'd spent extended time in the same house. Dorian forwarding her articles she might like, Isolde sending him photographs of things she'd seen that reminded her of conversations they'd had. I had found this endearing. What I found later was a parallel message thread they'd run on a second app, not the main messaging platform either of them used, that had been running for 9 months by the time I identified it. I found it because Isolde, in a moment of carelessness that I suspect still haunts her in the quieter hours of her nights, Andy had left herself logged in on a tablet I'd picked up from the living room table, thinking it was mine. The screens were the same model. We'd bought them in the same month. I looked at the tablet for 3 seconds before I understood it wasn't mine. I didn't read the messages immediately. I put the tablet down exactly where I'd found it. I went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, looking out at the garden. Then I went back, because I was not the kind of person who walked away from information, and I took very careful photographs of every screen. The nature of the documentation work I was doing had implications I want to be precise about, because this part matters if you're going to understand what came next. I was not simply gathering evidence of an affair. An affair, however painful, is not a crime. And what I was gathering was a comprehensive record of financial fraud, asset misappropriation, governance failures, and a pattern of conduct that, taken together, constituted a case I could bring to multiple regulatory bodies simultaneously: the Financial Conduct Authority, the company's auditors, and, with the right framing, a criminal fraud investigation. The affair documentation had a different purpose. It was not for regulators. It was for the story. I had understood for some time, probably since I first started working in corporate compliance, that the facts of a situation and the perception of a situation are two separate problems that require separate strategies. The facts were the regulatory case. The perception, the public understanding of who Dorian Calloway was and how he had operated, required a different kind of evidence. The message thread, the bracelet receipt, the photographs from the gala where they'd spent 40 minutes in a side room, I'd only noticed they were absent from because I'd gone to look for Dorian to introduce him to someone, and he hadn't been where I expected. I had not confronted either of them. I had documented. Over 8 months of quiet, methodical work, I built a file that was so complete that when I finally sent it to the journalist at the Thornfield Gazette, who had been writing financial accountability pieces for the past 2 years, a woman named Petra Cullum, whose work I'd read carefully and respected, she called me back within the hour. She said she needed to confirm 3 elements of the documentation before she could proceed. I confirmed them. I also sent copies to the FCA and to the Criminal Fraud Unit. All of this was packaged and scheduled from Josephine's cottage, on a laptop that Josephine had lent me, under the vellum consulting structure that shielded my involvement until I chose to reveal it. The timed send was set for 6 p.m. on the day of my funeral. I'd picked the date deliberately. There is something clarifying about specificity. Ambiguity is one of the ways that powerful men survive scrutiny. They let the story remain murky. Let there be room for doubt. Let the question of who did what remain unanswered long enough for people to lose interest. I was going to remove the ambiguity, but I was going to do it in a very particular order. The weeks at Josephine's cottage were not, as I have sometimes since described them to myself, a recovery. That implies a restoration to a previous state. Oh, and the person I was becoming was not a restoration of anything. She was a construction. I slept badly in the first 2 weeks. The cold had done something to my left shoulder, an inflammation that Josephine treated with the practical efficiency of someone who had no patience for suffering that could be addressed. She had a cabinet of medical supplies that suggested a long history of dealing with things herself, and she produced anti-inflammatories and a heat pack with the air of someone who had been expecting me to arrive eventually. Cabot the Greyhound slept at the foot of my bed. I spent the days at the table in Josephine's study, which smelled like old paper and the faint chemical clarity of a printer that ran several times a day. I worked methodically. As I organized the files I'd already compiled and identified the gaps, things I'd noted but not fully documented, patterns I'd identified, but not yet traced to their source. Josephine helped me with the legal framing. She had forgotten more commercial law than most practicing lawyers had ever known, and she could identify within minutes the difference between something that was technically permitted under the current regulatory structure and something that was technically permitted but would not survive scrutiny once examined by someone with the appropriate level of attention. Several of Dorian's arrangements were of the second type. "This property restructuring," Josephine said one afternoon, spreading the documents I'd given her across the table and weighing one corner with her coffee mug. "The amendment was filed with the correct office, but it bypassed the mandatory consent notification." "Consent from whom?" "From you, as the affected beneficiary," she pointed to a clause. "He was required by the trust instrument to notify you in writing and allow 14 days for objection. There's no record of notification." "Because he didn't notify me." "Then the amendment may be invalid on its face, which means the property interest may still exist." I looked at her. "I'm not telling you to fight for the house," she said, which was exactly what she was not telling me. "I'm telling you that when you present this file to legal counsel, that particular irregularity is worth flagging." I flagged it. It joined the growing architecture of the case. Not just financial fraud and affair documentation, but procedural violations, fiduciary failures, and a property interest that Dorian had believed was neatly resolved. He had been thorough. He was a thorough man. He had simply not imagined that anyone would be looking. I need to tell you about the phone call before the bridge because I've thought about it almost every day since, and I still don't have a complete answer. The voice had said, "Pull over before the bridge," someone who read the same documents you read. The accident happened 30 seconds later. 2 interpretations existed. The first was that the call was connected to the attack, a distraction, a way to slow me down so the car behind me could get into position. But the call had come from a number that, when I later traced it through Marcus Vane, all turned out to be registered to an address associated with a former Thornfield Holdings employee who had been quietly let go 18 months ago. A man named Edwin Corvus, who had been Dorian's personal financial analyst before he'd been made redundant and replaced by a Sablecroft associate. The second interpretation was that Edwin Corvus had somehow identified the same irregularities I had and had tried to warn me. Marcus was still working on it, but the detail mattered because it suggested that the Sablecroft arrangement had been large enough and suspicious enough that more than one person had noticed it. That detail would be included in the package to the Gazette. It would also be included in the note I'd prepared for Marcus. Not the USB drive I handed him at the funeral. That was the core documentation package. Oh, the financial records and governance violations. The note was a separate communication sent via Josephine's lawyer registration to a secure inbox Marcus had given me a code for. It laid out Edwin Corvus and what I believed he'd been trying to do. I left it to Marcus to determine whether it changed anything. 3 days before the funeral, I made a decision about how I would enter the church. I had discussed several options with Josephine, who had been characteristically unhurried in laying out the considerations and characteristically precise in noting where each approach carried risk. The simplest option was to walk in during the service, unannounced. The advantage was directness. No coordination required, no information sharing, no timing that depended on anyone else's behavior. The disadvantage was that I couldn't control what Dorian and Isolde did the moment they saw me. A public setting is not a guarantee of containment. It is, in fact, a perfect environment for a very specific kind of person to perform shock and distress, while quietly ensuring that every next move remains in their control. Dorian was exactly that kind of person. So I changed the approach. I would not make myself visible to Dorian at the moment I entered. I would enter at the back of the church while the service was in progress and remain near the back wall, concealed by the crowd and by a veil that would read as standard funeral attire. I would wait until after Dorian's address. I would let the engagement announcement happen. I wanted the announcement to happen. Because I wanted there to be witnesses to what Dorian and Isolde believed was their moment of arrival. I wanted the room to have heard them and to have formed an impression. And then I would hand the drive to Marcus and leave. That was the sequence. Not a confrontation, not a scene. A quiet action, completed, and then my departure through a side door. The confrontation, the public, documented confrontation would come not from me at a podium, but from Petra Kollm's story in the Gazette, which was scheduled for the weekend edition, and from the regulatory filings that were going to arrive in the inboxes of the FCA and the Criminal Fraud Unit before the end of the working day. By the time Dorian and Isolde left that church, the door would already be closing. They just wouldn't know it yet. The morning of the funeral, I dressed at Josephine's cottage. I'd bought the clothes in a shop in a town 20 miles south of Thornfield, paying cash 3 days before. Black coat, black dress, the veil I've already mentioned. Practical, anonymous. Josephine had pressed the coat the previous evening without being asked. She'd handed it to me without comment. This morning she poured coffee and set a plate of toast on the table and sat down across from me while I ate. She did not say anything that required a response. The cottage was quiet except for the sound of Cabot's nails on the flagstone floor as he moved between his bed and his water bowl. When I was done, I looked at her across the table. "I'll be back this afternoon," I said. "I'll have something warm ready." "Thank you." She met my eyes. Neither of us said anything else. Because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said. Josephine Aldermore had done in 8 weeks what most people never manage in a lifetime. She had given me exactly what I needed without making me explain why I needed it. She had treated me as a capable person in a difficult situation rather than a victim requiring management. I have thought since about what that specific thing, the decision to treat someone as capable, actually costs the person who offers it. It costs you the position of helper. It costs you the narrative of rescue. You don't get to be the person who saved her. You get to be the person who handed her what she needed and stepped back. Josephine had stepped back 8 weeks ago and hadn't stepped forward since. I stood up. I put on the coat. I picked up the USB drive from the table where I'd left it and put it in my coat pocket. I drove myself to St. Aldrich's. I stood against the back wall of the church for 37 minutes. I have already told you what I observed. The 200 people, the framed photograph, the priest's remarks, the way Dorian's hand went to his collar, the moment Isolde lifted her chin. What I haven't told you yet is what happened in the 36 seconds between Dorian's announcement and my movement toward Marcus. There was one woman in the congregation who did not shift, did not murmur, did not reach for a handkerchief or whisper to her neighbor. She sat in the 4th pew from the front, on the right side of the aisle, and she kept her eyes on the floor in front of her. Her name was Dana Calloway, Dorian's mother. She was 70 years old and had the spine of a woman who had made a discipline of composure. In the 5 years of our marriage, she had treated me with a careful, warm courtesy that I had understood to be genuine. Not warmth of the unguarded kind, but the kind that is built deliberately, brick by brick, because someone has decided you are worth the material. She had sent me a card on every birthday. She had remembered that I disliked roses and arranged for a different flower at our wedding reception. She had once, at a family dinner that had grown tense for reasons I couldn't fully identify, put her hand over mine under the table and pressed it briefly before removing it. She did not look up at the engagement announcement. She kept her eyes on the floor. And I watched her for those 36 seconds and understood that she was not surprised by the announcement, but that she was not performing approval either. She was sitting in the position of someone absorbing a fact they had known was coming and had been unable to prevent. Had she tried to prevent it? I didn't know. Did it change what I was doing? It did not. But it did settle something in my understanding of the situation, confirmed a piece of the map. Some people in Dorian's orbit were participants, some were bystanders, and some were witnesses who had been unable to act, for reasons that were their own. Dana Calloway would receive a separate communication, not from me directly, from Josephine through legal channels in 2 weeks' time. It would contain documentation of the property trust amendment that had removed me as a beneficial owner, along with a notation that the trust had originally been established by her late husband's family and that the amendment's legal validity was still under review. It would also contain my current address. I would let her choose what to do with it. Marcus Vane took the USB drive without breaking his scan of the room. He was good. He did not look at me. He did not change his posture or his expression. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides and let the drive disappear into his coat pocket in one smooth movement that looked, from any angle, like nothing. I walked past him and pushed open the side door. The morning air came in hard and cold and smelled like autumn leaves and exhaust from the road beyond the churchyard. As I walked through the churchyard, past the old section with its leaning markers and the newer section where the stones were still white and flat, I did not look at the temporary marker that had been placed in the plot purchased for me. A plot that, I had learned from a document that arrived in Josephine's mail last week, had been purchased by Dorian 12 days after the accident. He had moved quickly on all of it. I walked through the gate onto the road. Josephine's second car, an unremarkable dark sedan that I'd been using for the past 2 weeks, was parked at the corner. I unlocked it. I sat in the driver's seat and let the door close. The church was behind me and to the left. Through the rearview mirror, I could see the stone facade and the dark row of cars parked along the lane. At 5:59 p.m., I would log into the Vellum system from Josephine's laptop and confirm that the send had not been canceled. At 6 p.m., Petra Colm at the Gazette would receive a package of documentation so organized and so specific that I had, in preparing it, included a one-page index of its contents with cross-references to each section. She was a good journalist. She would have it verified within 24 hours. She would publish in the weekend edition. The FCA referral would arrive in the appropriate inbox simultaneously. The criminal fraud unit referral would arrive 2 minutes later. Both had been drafted by Josephine and signed off by a lawyer in a city 3 hours away who had been briefed in full and who was currently holding a separate copy of all the documentation in a fireproof archive. Dorian would leave the church this afternoon believing that the hardest part was behind him. He would be wrong by approximately 3 days. I want to be specific about what the documentation strategy had actually secured, because I said this part matters and I meant it. The financial case rested on 3 primary mechanisms. The first was the Sablecroft transfers. Over 31 months, the account had received approximately $2.4 million in unauthorized transfers from Thornfield Holdings subsidiaries. The transfers had been structured to avoid automatic flagging, but the pattern, combined with the authorization trail leading exclusively back to Dorian, constituted strong evidence of misappropriation of company funds. Sablecroft Consulting had no website, no registered directors except one, a name that, when traced, led to a postal address associated with a third party who had no apparent connection to finance or consulting. The second mechanism was the Red Veil Partners contract, $300,000 in consulting fees for a project that existed only on paper. The invoices were professionally formatted, but the project specifications referenced a site address that turned out to be a retail car park. I had the invoices, the approval documents, the site photographs, and the land registry records confirming the address. The third mechanism was the governance failure around the compensation adjustment. Dorian had signed off on his own compensation revision in a quarter, where the board had been incorrect by the standards of the company's Articles of Association. One of the 3 board members present for the vote had, in their response to a later audit query, recorded that they hadn't realized the vote was taking place, that they had believed the meeting was informational only. That record was in the archive. These 3 mechanisms, taken together, gave the FCA enough to open a formal investigation. The criminal fraud referral included a separate analysis, Josephine's work, that argued the Sablecroft structuring specifically constituted fraud by false representation. Marcus had told me, through the secure channel, that the Sablecroft element aligned with something his unit had already been looking at from a different direction. He hadn't given me details. He hadn't needed to. He had told me that if I could bring him primary documentation, it would move the investigation from circumstantial to evidenced. The USB drive contained 2014 primary source documents. I had counted them, I had indexed them, I had cross-referenced them in a master document that ran to 47 pages. It was, I think, the most organized thing I had ever produced in my life, and I had spent 3 years as a compliance officer. There is a part of this that I have not yet told you, which is the part about Isolde. Dorian is straightforward to understand in the way that predatory people often are once you've accepted what they are. He saw an opportunity. He structured his position to take advantage of it. He was patient, and he was thorough, and he did not feel much, which made him effective and also made him genuinely dangerous. Because people who don't feel much will take actions that people who feel a great deal would pull back from. Pushing a car off the Caldwell Bridge, for instance. I believe that was Dorian's decision and Dorian's action, but I cannot prove it in the way that would satisfy a criminal standard. What I can demonstrate, and what I have documented, is that on the morning of the accident, at 6:47 a.m., a vehicle registered to a company called Ironbridge Properties sent a fuel receipt from a petrol station 4 miles from the Caldwell Bridge. Ironbridge Properties was a subsidiary of the same holding structure as Sablecroft. I can demonstrate that Dorian had signing authority over Ironbridge. I can demonstrate that he had made, in the 48 hours before the accident, 3 calls to a number associated with a private security firm. I cannot, from what I have, construct the final causal chain. That is Marcus's work. Isolde is more complicated to understand because Isolde is not straightforward. She is a person of real feeling who has chosen over many years to subordinate that feeling to the pursuit of things she believed she was owed. She was smart, genuinely smart, in ways I had always respected and sometimes envied. She was also, in the deepest part of herself, someone who had spent her whole life standing next to women she felt outshone by and had decided at some point that it was not something she was willing to continue doing. I was not outshining her. That was a story she told herself, a map she imposed on a situation that didn't require it. We were simply different, and she had turned the difference into a competition I hadn't known I was in. She had watched Dorian choose me and had, with a patience I can only now fully appreciate, waited. And then she had stopped waiting. I do not know exactly when Isolde became a participant rather than a bystander in what Dorian was planning. The message thread suggests that she knew about the property restructuring within weeks of it happening, which meant Dorian told her, which meant she had moved from passive awareness to active alliance at least 14 months before the accident. There is a message sent from Dorian to Isolde in the 2nd month of their private thread that I have read so many times I no longer see the words as words. It reads, "You know this has to go slow. She's careful." Isolde's response, "She's careful, but she thinks she understands the situation. People who think they understand everything stop looking." She was not wrong about me. I did think I understood the situation. Notice I had stopped looking in exactly the places where I needed to look, until I didn't. The message thread was in the package to the Gazette. Petra Colum would find it. Petra Colum would know exactly what it meant. I drove back through Thornfield without stopping. The town looked the same as it always had, the high street with its covered market, the row of older buildings along the river, the estates to the south where the houses grew larger and the gardens longer. I had grown up here. I had come back here when Dorian moved back to take over the family role at Thornfield Holdings. I had expected to stay. I took the road that ran south of town rather than through it because I didn't want to pass the Thornfield Holdings building, which sat on the main square and which I had, for 6 months, been watching from across the street in my mind while I built my case. I was done watching from across the street. The drive back to Josephine's cottage took 22 minutes. I parked on the gravel beside the house. Cabot came to the door when he heard the car. I sat in the car for 3 minutes before I went in. Not because I was undone. I was not undone. I was applying to the situation exactly the same stillness I had applied to everything in the past 8 weeks. I was sitting there because there is a moment after any action is complete when you have to let the completion land. When you have to allow yourself to know that the thing you have been preparing for is no longer in front of you. It has moved behind you, into the category of done. The drive was in Marcus's pocket. The sends were scheduled and running. A moment I had walked into my own funeral and stood in the back while the man who had tried to kill me announced his engagement to my sister, and I had felt nothing that I could not name precisely and account for. What I had felt, standing against that stone wall, was the specific cold clarity of a person who has all the information, who has organized it, documented it, and released it in the right direction, who knows that the story has already been written and is simply waiting to be told. I got out of the car. Josephine opened the door before I reached it. She had soup on the stove. I could smell it from the step, something with onions and herbs. She looked at me. "Done?" she said. "Done," I said. She stepped back to let me in. In the days that followed, here is what happened. On the day after the funeral, Marcus called Josephine's mobile, the number registered to the secure channel, and said 3 words, "Drive checks out." The Friday after that, Petra Colum published the first of what would become a 4-part investigation in the Thornfield Gazette. The first piece covered the Sablecroft transfers and the Red Veil contract. Its headline used the phrase unexplained payments, and the byline was Petricolum. Within 48 hours, 3 Mouse national papers had picked up the story for further investigation. Dorian's lawyers issued a statement on the Saturday morning describing the allegations as without merit, and noting that their client was cooperating with any and all legitimate inquiries. Cooperating, by that Monday, meant accompanying Marcus's colleagues to a formal interview at the Financial Crimes Unit's offices, which he had no choice about because the invitation had not been optional. The FCA opened a formal investigation on the Tuesday. On the Wednesday, the Gazette published the second piece. This one covered the governance failure and the compensation adjustment. It also, in a paragraph near the bottom, mentioned that the company's records suggested the late Celeste Calloway had been responsible for a significant portion of the compliance work covering the period in question, and that questions existed about whether her accident had occurred at a time that was convenient for those with exposure to the emerging financial irregularities. Petricolum was, as I'd assessed, a good journalist. She did not speculate beyond what the record supported. She noted the timeline. She noted the irregularities in the vehicle records connected to Ironbridge properties. She noted that the accident investigation had been formally reopened. On the Friday of that week, I was no longer dead. The announcement of my survival came through Josephine's lawyer, who filed a formal declaration with the registry office. There was paperwork, there was a medical assessment confirming my identity and my present health. There was a statement, carefully drafted, that noted I had been in a serious accident and had been receiving care in a private capacity and had been advised against public disclosure while my safety remained a concern. All of this was true. Dorian was informed through his solicitors. I was not present for that communication. I have, from Marcus, a second-hand account of the moment, not details. Just the description of a man who sat very still for a long time before saying anything. I found I didn't need the details. Isolde, to my knowledge, learned from the news coverage rather than from any direct communication. She had moved into the estate house the previous week, the house that I still had a legal interest in, per Josephine's analysis of the trust amendment. Her solicitor contacted my solicitor on the same day the second Gazette piece ran. That conversation was ongoing, about what I lost, because I think this part belongs in the account. I lost 5 years. A marriage that was, for at least part of its duration, something I believed in. A version of my life that I had built an extended effort into. A relationship with my sister that I had spent 31 years maintaining with more care than she had ever known. Because I had loved her in the particular way you love someone who requires more from you than they know how to ask for. That loss was real. I am not the kind of person who pretends it wasn't, but here is the thing about documentation. It doesn't leave room for ambiguity. When you have everything organized and time-stamped and cross-referenced, you cannot rewrite the sequence of events. You cannot let yourself drift into the version of the story where things were more uncertain than they were, where maybe she didn't know, where maybe he didn't mean to, where maybe it was complicated. I had read the message thread. I had the timestamps. I had done to Dorian and Isolde what they had done to me, which was look at the evidence without flinching and accept what it meant. And yet what it meant was that I was not confused about what had happened, or uncertain about what I was doing. What I was doing was beginning something new from a documented, evidenced, legally supported position, which is the only kind of beginning that is actually stable. Josephine walked me out to the car on the morning I left her cottage. It was early November by then, a gray morning, the kind where the sky and the ground are almost the same color, and the light comes from everywhere and nowhere. Cabot stood beside her. I had my bag in the car. I had a flat I'd taken in a city 60 miles north of Thornfield, under my own name now, because my name was mine again and I intended to use it. I had, through Josephine's contacts, 3 employment conversations arranged with firms that had no connection to Thornfield Holdings and whose primary recommendation of me came through a professional network that predated my marriage. I stood by the car and looked at Josephine. "I want to say thank you properly," I said, "but I don't think there's a proper way to say it for what you did." She made a small, precise gesture with her hand, not dismissive, but refusing a certain category of weight. "You did the work," she said. "I gave you a table." "You gave me considerably more than a table." "Then I'll say, I know." She looked at me steadily. Go and do something that matters. You know how. I got in the car. I drove north. The last thing I want to tell you is small, and I want to tell it carefully. In the second week at Josephine's cottage, all before I'd fully recovered my physical strength, when my shoulder still ached in cold weather, and I was sleeping 10 hours a night and eating everything Josephine put in front of me, I had a morning where I sat at the kitchen table and could not move. Not from grief, not from rage, from the plain, enormous weight of understanding what had happened to me. Not the fraud, not the affair, not even the car going off the bridge. The understanding that the people I had shared my closest life with had sat across from me at tables, had slept in rooms near me, had listened to me speak and said words back, and had been, in the most fundamental sense, completely elsewhere. That particular knowledge is a different category of cold from anything physical. I sat with it for approximately 40 minutes. Then I got up, I put the kettle on, I opened the laptop, I went back to the file. Not because grief doesn't deserve its time, it does, but because the file was also mine. The work was also mine, and the work had a shape and a direction and a concrete destination that the grief did not yet have. I was, as I have said, the kind of person who noticed things, who kept records, who understood that information has a weight and a direction, and that if you organize it carefully enough, it moves. I had organized it carefully enough. I made my tea, I sat back down, I went back to work. Josephine once told me, in one of the few directly personal things she said across those 8 weeks, that she had spent the first 30 years of her career believing that justice was slow. And she had spent the second 30 years believing something more specific, that justice is slow when it is left to find its own way. When someone who understands the system gives it the right documentation at the right moment, it moves considerably faster. She had said this without looking at me, examining a clause in a trust document, her reading glasses on the end of her nose. I wrote it down, not because I needed reminding, but because she was right, and she was one of the rare people in my life who had said something true in a moment when I needed truth, and the right way to honor that is to hold it precisely. On the morning I walked into St. Aldrich's, I was holding that thought somewhere below everything else. Under the veil, under the cold air, under the 200 people in black, under the photograph of myself on an easel with the pearl earrings I'd worn to a gala where Dorian took my picture and called me beautiful. I had given it the right documentation. Now I had given it the right moment. I got in the car. I drove north. I did not look in the rearview mirror. The door closed behind me like a sentence that was finally finished. That's the story. That's Celeste. You're watching Eternal Diary.